Welcome to Business Leadership Podcast. In this podcast, I interview successful business leaders and industry experts to help you grow your business. In this episode, I had a very interesting discussion with Todd Cherches. Todd is a CEO and co-founder of BigBlueGumball, an innovative New York-based consulting firm specializing in leadership development, public speaking, and executive coaching. He's also a 3-time award-winning Adjunct Professor of Leadership at NYU, a lecturer on leadership at Columbia University, a TEDx speaker, The Power of Visual Thinking, and the author of Visual Leadership, Leveraging the Power of Visual Thinking in the Leadership and in Life. His unique and innovative visual leadership methodology leverages the power of visual thinking and visual communication to help his client maximize their performance, their productivity, and their potential through the use of visual imagery, mental notes and framework, metaphors, and a leadership storytelling. This was very interesting discussion. We talk about many different topics around the business leadership, communication, and building culture. Todd's methodology on a visual leadership is a great tool to improve your communication. In his book, he used a lot of imagery to explain all these concepts. In a business communication, we always use numbers, graphs to get our message across. But if you can use visuals to it, not only will improve your messaging or communication, but it will also help you to build a culture in your team as well. As a business leaders, I'm always looking to improve my communication. If you're looking to take your communication to the next level, I will strongly recommend get a copy of Todd's book. And also, when you're listening to this discussion, make sure you get a pen and notebook handy, because Todd shared a lot of tools and concept even when I write it down, because I had to write down a lot of concept during this discussion as well. Hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as I did. Don't forget to send me your feedback. Until next time, enjoy. Hi guys, welcome to Business Leadership Podcast. Today my guest is someone very special from New York, Todd Cherches. Todd, your area of expertise, I was just blown away from your book, a very interesting book, and I never, understood the way you explain in a lot of topics that apply to leadership. So I'm looking forward to learning from you, looking forward to our discussion. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me. I always enjoy your show. You always have great guests on your show.
Beautiful. So quickly, if you can walk us through, you've been talking to a lot of people, you've been working with a lot of business leaders. We've gone through a couple of years of a very serious disruption. Where do you think some of the challenges and opportunities that business leaders are up against as we pass that disruption?
Yeah, the biggest challenge I'm finding among clients, and I also teach leadership at NYU and Columbia here in New York, is managing and leading in a post-pandemic hybrid world, right? All the rules have changed, the expectations have changed, the old way doesn't work anymore. Some companies want to turn the calendar back to 2019 and pretend this whole thing never happened. I do a lot of work around visual metaphors. So when the train's left the station, the genie's out of the bottle, the toothpaste is out of the tube, whichever one you want to use, we're not going backwards. So we need to think about, all right, how can we go forward to meet the needs of organizations, but also meet the needs of a diverse employee population? So I think that, to me, among clients and students, that's the biggest challenge that everyone is wrestling with. The whole return to office versus work from home versus hybrid. How do we onboard people? How do we build culture? How do we build teams? How do we manage and lead? So there's no, the old way of managing by walking around, where a leader gets up and walks around, stops by people's desks and say, how's your day going? Well, you can't do that if you're at home, or they're at home, or they're only in Tuesdays and Thursdays, right? So what's the new way of doing things? I think everyone's just trying to figure that out right now.
Wow. So does that mean that leaders have to do more work on themselves before they go out and tackle these challenges? It looks like they got to polish their skill set and kind of work on themselves first. Figure out what this short on a skill set and polish those skill sets.
Yeah, I agree. It's like the lens. One of the idea behind visual leadership, and the rainbow colored eye on the color of my book represents the fact that just as no one in the world has a rainbow colored eye, no one in the world sees the world through the same lens that you do, right? So where you sit as a leader is not where the people below you sit, or the employees down below you on the organizational chart. So we need to try to see things through a new lens. We need to reflect back and look, what I call flipping the eye, look internally at your biases, your assumptions, your belief systems, your prejudices, your biases, everything else, and try to see things not only through a new lens for yourself, but try to see things through the lens of all your stakeholders, through your board's lens, your people, your clients. So I think it takes a little more. There's no one size fits all solution. There never was, but even more than ever, there's more diversity than ever. And it's every category. It's cultural diversity, ethnic, gender, generational. So we need to try to see things from multiple perspectives. So I said, sometimes we look through a telescope out into the future, sometimes a microscope, you look down into the details, and other times we need to look through a kaleidoscope, right? And mix things up, shake things up, and use all the colors of the rainbow to see things in completely new ways.
Wow. So, the great book, I haven't finished the whole book, but great book. Just a little bit left for me to finish. But what did you mean by visual leader? If you can just bring our audience up to date, what does that mean to you, visual leader term?
Yeah, visual leadership is kind of my own. First of all, it's a trademark brand. I applied to the US Patent Office. It was rejected twice, but finally the third time they agreed. So it's the title of my book. It is my brand, and it's an approach. So visual leadership, if you ask a leader, when you say the word leadership, and I talk about this in my TED Talk on the power of visual thinking, when you say the word leadership and you say, what's the first word that comes to your mind? Very often the word vision.
Visionary or vision or visionary.
And so what does it mean to have a leadership vision? What does it mean to be a visionary leader or a visual leader? It's about seeing things in a new way, right? It's about seeing the future. It's about envisioning, right? The word envision has the word vision in it, right? It's about picturing in your mind's eye a future state that's different from and better than the current reality. So as a leader, you may be very clear in your own mind about what the future looks like, but how do you get other people to see what you're saying? How do you get that idea, that vision out of your head and into the heads of others? That's one of the biggest challenges that leaders face. So you need to formulate a vision. And part two is you need to communicate that vision in a clear and compelling way. And I would say that there's facts, figures, and feelings. People are not motivated by facts and figures. They're motivated by feelings. So what story are you telling? What metaphors are you using? What picture are you painting? That's what visual leadership is all about. It's about communicating what you want the future to look like, and enabling other people to see it as well. Otherwise, you're not going to turn that vision into reality.
Yeah, and you explain very well in a book with a lot of visuals, aids with a lot of pictures. So, I'm guilty of that as well. My understanding, a lot of business leaders, I know they do that. So how about charts and putting numbers together in a diagram and showing forecast for the years or next 6 months? What are your thoughts on that? Is it not enough for us to explain what are we trying to get to?
I wish it was, but it is not. As I mentioned, facts, figures, and feelings. So many people, like CFOs, will bore people to death with the numbers. If you say we're going to increase shareholder value by 10% over the next quarter, you're not going to get a rousing, applause for that, and that's not going to get people up and out of bed in the morning, right? One of the chapters in my book is called "How My Cardiologist Almost Gave Me a Heart Attack," and it talks about how if you deliver, the short story is, if you deliver numbers, don't tell the whole story. Numbers, in fact, are meaningless outside of their context and outside of the story that you're trying to tell. So just giving people data is not motivational. It's not even informational unless you think about, all right, what story is this data telling us? So that's a mindset shift that leaders need to face, is get your head out of the numbers and the spreadsheets and say, all right, how does this translate into a reality? How does this motivate us or help us to make decisions or set priorities? So I think that's something to think about. So facts and figures need to be translated into feelings if you want to motivate and inspire people to take action and to feel engaged in their job and in their work.
Yeah, it's an old saying that a picture tells 1,000 words. I think it applies here. So you can, if you can visualize it, you can explain and you can communicate it much effectively.
Definitely. Walt Disney said, if you could dream it, you could do it, right? So, but we need to dream it first. And there's a saying that all things are twice created, first in our minds and then out there in the world, right? So it's about, we need to envision and picture, what are we doing? Is it a product, a service? Is it where you are in the marketplace? It's, whatever it is, we need to, it starts as a thought. It starts as an idea and then becomes a vision and a strategy, and then eventually a plan that you need to implement. And you need metrics, right? So I don't want to underplay that. Peter Drucker said, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, right? So you need to put in some kind of performance metrics to gauge where you started and how well you're doing. But that's not the whole story. That's just part of it.
So what we're saying, Todd, if I can play back that, yeah, you need a metrics, but around those metrics, you need to create a visual some sort of visual images, and not only use those metrics, but some sort of visuals gotta incorporate some sort of story that you gotta what's the end result to be looking at.
Exactly. In my book, I break it down into 4 categories. So category 1 is using visual imagery, which could be drawings, it could be props, it could be demonstrations. It's something that you could see with your physical eye. So for example, if let's say there's an issue that no one's talking about, I may take this out and say, we're not addressing the elephant in the room, right? So what is that? So that's one of the chapters in my book. So when we see the elephant in the room, that's a metaphor that represents what is that big thing that's right there that no one's addressing, right? So just by holding this up, it reminds people that there's something there. If someone's talking and sounding really outdated and it sounds like they're talking from the 1980s, I'll hold up my dinosaur and say, you're going to go extinct if you don't change your I hope people watching this on video, if you're listening on audio, it's just I'm holding up a dinosaur. But just like that visual, I don't even need to say a word to my client. If I'm coaching them on Zoom and I hold up my dinosaur, it means you need to question your thinking and it might be a little outdated. So again, I have tons of these. I have hundreds of props, so I can keep them coming. This reminds me to always try to be more flexible and that we need to bend over backwards to serve our clients, right? So again, but it's the power of the visual imagery and the humor that helps the message to resonate, right? So I could just tell you, we need to address that big issue, but that elephant in the room, you can actually picture it, right? So category 1 is visual imagery. Category 2 is mental models and frameworks. So if you picture the company's organizational chart, that's a visual representation of the hierarchy. If you picture a 4-box matrix like SWOT analysis or a time management matrix, or there could be a staircase or a circle, a Venn diagram. We put things into boxes so we could see things more clearly, and it helps to simplify complexity so we can kind of categorize things and wrap our minds around things, right? So that's the category 2. Category 3 is using metaphors and analogies. Like if we say that's just the tip of the iceberg, or you hit that, how did I do my presentation? You struck out or you hit it out of the park. Those are baseball metaphors that we use, right? So that's category 3, using metaphor and analogy. And category 4 is using storytelling and humor. So if a leader says, let me tell you about the biggest mistake I ever made, don't you think his or her people want to hear what that was so that they don't repeat it? Or if I'm doing exercises with my classes or workshops, I may say, tell us about the best team you were ever on or the worst. Tell us about the biggest mistake you ever made or the best or worst boss you ever had. It's through sharing stories that we learn from each other. Stories are human. They are memorable. They have beginnings, middles, and ends. There are villains, victims, and heroes. So you are the hero of your own life story, right? So that's something I help leaders think about, is don't always make yourself the star and the hero in your story. Make your people the hero, right? So just by shifting it. So if you're wondering why people are not engaged, maybe it's because they feel like they're a supporting character or they're just an extra in this movie. They don't feel like they have a speaking part, right? So I was talking about 3 V's, visibility, voice, and value. Are you seen? Are you heard? And are you making a contribution? And are you recognized for that contribution? So these are just a few of the concepts from my book that help to break things down in a visual way. That's it's just a new way of looking at how you lead and how you manage people.
Very powerful, the way you explain all those concepts. There's a lot of information to digest in this, but very powerful. When you add visual aid to when you're trying to explain something and you hold up that whether it's dinosaur or elephant, it comes across very powerfully. I think especially when you're business, in any leadership position, when you use that aid, it becomes very powerful. In the same way we use videos in a communication, it becomes powerful.
Exactly. Yeah, so sometimes it's visual imagery that you could take in through your eye, but it could also be visual language that you take in through your ear, right? So a metaphor could be taken in through your ear. A story can be heard. It doesn't have to be seen. But when you're telling it or using it, people are picturing it in their mind, right? So if I say to a coaching client, what do you need to stop doing, start doing, and continue doing, right, to be effective? I may hold up this traffic signal, right? So this is what's working that you want to continue, what's not working that you need to stop, and then what should we do instead, and what do you want to start doing? So just the visual of the traffic signal, you could see as you go about your day, oh, this is something I should stop doing. You almost see that red light flash. If you're working on something and it's not producing or not working, you could say red light, right? So you just know, right? And I ask my clients, if you could magically change just one thing about your job or your work, what would it be? Now, there is no magic wand. You still have to do the work, but it eliminates the judgment and the constraints, because you may say, well, I'd like to do this, but this is impossible. Let's forget about what's possible versus impossible. If anything was possible, what would you want to change? What would be different or better? And then use that as the starting point. So you remove all that critical thinking and the judgments and the negativity, and you picture what's possible, and then say, all right, let's figure out, maybe we can't get all the way there, but can we get part of the way there, right? So it starts with a small change. So again, these are just different ways of shifting your mindset in a way that you could envision, new ways of working, new ways of communicating and thinking.
Yeah, what I just noticed that while you were explaining that and holding those objects, simply, our thought processes are working even when somebody's talking. Our thought process is still going on. But when you hold those objects in front of it, it kind of controls your thought process and focus right on an object instead of me going in the wild and trying to think, what's going, what is my thoughts going to go and how do I control it? It gets a lot more focused, and you just extremely focus on those objects and the visuals.
Yeah, I love that you use the word focus, because in my TED Talk, I talk about 3 words: attention, comprehension, and retention. When you use visual imagery or visual language, it gets people to focus, so it captures their attention. If I'm holding something up, you're not looking at your phone, you're looking at what I'm showing you, right? That's why show and tell, we do that in grade school, right? So attention, how do you get people to focus? Comprehension, when you use visual imagery or visual language, it helps people to understand. And retention, the way our brains are wired, we're wired for visuals, right? So you will remember something that you see a lot longer and a lot clearer than if you just hear it, right? So anytime you could leverage not only audio, but video or visual in your communication, you're going to be more effective. So that's a great point that you make. It really increases the focus, the understanding, and the recall. And then you could say, all right, what do we need to change? Because how often do we read a book or have a conversation that we forget about it 5 minutes later? We can't even remember it. But you don't forget a story that has a powerful lesson, right? So if you tell someone, let me tell you about the worst mistake I ever made, they're never going to forget that.
Yeah. How about drawing when we were in office, running a teams from office, I had a habit of drawing something on a whiteboard. Or does that drawing on a board works the same way that these products works?
Yeah, whether it's a napkin sketch, you're sitting at a bar with someone and grab a cocktail napkin, it doesn't matter, or the back of an envelope, or you get up at a whiteboard or a flip chart. In fact, I was doing that in my NYU class last night, teaching my students. There's a saying that he or she who wields the pen wields the power. So let's say you're sitting in a boardroom and people are not hearing or understanding each other. Think about how powerful it looks from a leadership perspective to grab a marker, get up at a whiteboard and say, if I hear you correctly, let me map this out. Right? It could be stick figures. And even if you suffer from ICD, which is I can't draw syndrome, if you could just draw a circle, a square, a triangle, and a line, you have the skills to play Pictionary, but also to sketch out. And it could be something literal like a process map. It could be a mind map. It could be a storyboard. But just the fact that you can get it out of your head and up onto some paper or some other medium so that other people could look at it, then they could say, oh, no, that's not what I meant at all. Or I would move this over here. But without seeing the same thing, you could be talking about completely different things. So that's one of the values and the power of using visuals, video, and especially drawing to sketch something out. So that's a great skill to develop. And again, you don't have to be a great artist. You just need to be able to think visually and say, all right, how can I communicate this in a way that people will get what I'm talking about?
You mentioned the term just now for, I was about to mention that I believe that I'm a worse at drawing and not a very killer writing on a board. My handwriting is very poor.
Yeah.
So a lot of business leaders listening us, watching us, they probably think the same way. Listen, I'm not good at drawing. So how can I be very good at putting something visual?
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is when I frame it this way: when you ask a group of 5-year-olds how many of you could draw, how many raise their hands?
Yeah.
All of them.
A lot of
right.
Them. Yeah.
You ask a group of business people the same question, very few raise their hands, right? So from age, I'm sure you could draw better than a 5-year-old, right? So have we lost our ability or our confidence from age 5 to 25 or 45 or 65? It's something that a lot of times drawing is just not on our radar, or we feel like we're going to be criticized or we're going to be judged. If you remove that, so what part of the work I do is I train people to, and again, I am not the greatest drawer in the world, but in my TED Talk, I talk about how I was managing a theme park project in China. And they didn't speak English, we didn't speak Chinese. So whenever we needed something like a hammer or a screwdriver or any tool or whatever, I had to draw it. I drew it on a piece of paper, and they knew exactly what we needed. So that was where that's like my origin story of how I use drawing. But my whole life I've been doodling and sketching and everything. But again, my drawing skills are not great. We could all get better at them. It's just practice like any other skill. But I'm sure any leader can get up at a whiteboard and just with a few lines, circles, and squares can map out an idea. I wrote an article for Inc. magazine that anyone could just Google and find it for free. It's called "Can You Draw What Your Company Does?" If you had to get up at a whiteboard and draw a picture that would illustrate what it is that your company does and how you're different from and better than the competition, how would you illustrate that? Whether it was internal or external. So if you read that article, you'll see the story I tell and how a company changed their whole way of doing business based on this one 15-minute exercise. So it's an exercise that anyone could do, and it's a good test to see how would you map out what it is that you do and where your problems are, whether it's in your supply chain or whatever it is. How would you visually represent what's going on in your world so that you can talk about it and find identify problems and find solutions?
One of the item you mentioned, I learned from you from our last discussion and going through your book as well. You mentioned that you can, something you can visualize, you can achieve it. Back to the term you mentioned, what I noticed, Todd, was, the goals I'm trying to achieve, I visualize in my head, but I was translating those goals into numbers so I can explain it to my teams. But what I learned from going through your book is I don't need to translate. Well, I need to translate, but I need to go back to that image I had in my head, what I wanted to achieve, and explain that image to people instead of just explaining the numbers. And I think it's very powerful. And I didn't think that the image I had, the vision I have for the company I want to create, I could explain it the same way. But you made it so simple for me to explain that. That is much easier to explain and more powerful that way than instead of me just taking numbers and trying to explain, hey, this is what I'm trying to build as a company.
Yeah, because you're starting with the visual and then you're translating to numbers, and then you're just presenting the numbers and you're expecting your people to have that same visual that you started out with. Why not just go visual to visual, right? And then let's talk about the numbers, right? So you're starting with, if you think about it this way, the big idea is what you see in the telescope, and then the numbers are what you see through a microscope, right? So give your people that same telescopic view that you have, and then together let's look through the microscope together, right, and figure out the numbers, and then we'll put together a plan. Because like you wouldn't build a building without a blueprint or a schematic. You wouldn't put in the wiring without mapping out where the outlets are going, right? You need a map or a blueprint of everything that we do. You can't just assume people are going to put the outlets or whatever in the right place just because you had a picture in your head of how you wanted it to look, right? So think about any time you've ever hired a contractor to do some work in your house or whatever, and think about the times where they did what you wanted versus the times that you didn't. And one of my mantras is that people are not mind readers, right? Anytime you say, well, why didn't you just do this? Or you should have done this. Well, they had a pick. They weren't trying to be wrong, right? They had an understanding of what you were saying, but whose fault is it? One of my chapters is called Ice, Rice, or Mice. Has this ever happened to you? And one time I was in a restaurant and I asked for some more ice cubes for my drink, but they brought me a bowl of white rice. So I said more ice, they heard more rice. So whose fault was that? So I needed more rice anyway, so there wasn't a problem, and there was only a $3 charge. But what if it was a bigger issue? What if it was like not a $3 bowl of rice, but $100,000 project, and someone went ahead and did the wrong thing? They did what they thought you said versus what you actually wanted, right? So the scale and scope could be tiny, but it could be huge as well. So people are not mind readers. And I would say the burden of communication is on the communicator. So if someone doesn't understand you, whose fault is that? It may be both. Maybe they weren't listening, but you didn't close the feedback loop to make sure that they understood what you said, right? So communication is such a crucial issue, and visual thinking and communicating will really help eliminate so many problems and costs and everything else.
Yeah, it's a research over the years, Todd, what you just mentioned. I've gone through so many books, and they said, listen, build up a plan, what we need to do, what we need to achieve. And I always thought, for some reasons, that the visual imagery I have in my head is people not going to understand, but if I explain that in a number, they will understand what I'm trying to do. But it's other way around, what you just what I learned from you is it's no, it's the other way around. They will understand the visual better than just a number, because I was thinking numbers going to be easy for them to understand, but that's not what it sounds like.
Yeah, and also it's not an either or, but a both, right? It's really right. Just the image is not going to do the trick, and just the numbers or the words is not going to do the trick. When you use both together, and it's a concept, and you can look it up. It's called dual coding theory, DUAL, as in two. When you use images, you can use images or you can use words and numbers, but when you use both together, leveraging both right brain and left brain, that is the magic formula. So that is when dual coding theory is when you code something visually and verbally and bring them together. It's more powerful and effective than either one or the other in isolation. So always think about, there's a learning technique called VARK, V-A-R-K, and they're not learning styles, but they are learning approaches. VARK stands for visual, auditory, reading and writing, and kinesthetic. So whenever you can incorporate all four of those modalities, the visual is what people see, the auditory is what they hear, reading and writing would be like the numbers or the facts that you write down, and kinesthetic is learning through doing or touch or feel or movement. So anytime you can incorporate all four of those modalities into a presentation or into training someone, you are going to be more effective, because people learn not just from hearing, but from reading and from doing and from teaching, right? So if you ask someone to explain something back to you, or you ask someone to give you an example, or say, can you give me a metaphor, how would you explain that? That's a good test to see whether or not they understand and you're on the same page. Because if not, you could always fine tune it or tweak it and say, that's not what I meant, or this might be a better analogy, but then you're on the same page. Right. So I think that's a big problem, is, one of the biggest problems in life, not just in business, is miscommunications, because you expect people to be able to read your mind, and they just, no matter how well you know them, or how much you think alike, it's not 100%. So
communication is the biggest challenge that I find in my business as well, Todd. We run a technology company, but communication is a piece that, because we happen to have a lot of young people on a team, but communication is the biggest obstacle, no matter what age group. So other part you mentioned, Todd, was storytelling. So you got a visual, you got your visuals, and you got your numbers. But how does a storytelling plug in? And this is also another item that where most business leaders will say, "Hey, I'm not good at telling stories."
Yeah.
So how do they plug that in?
Yeah, I was once doing a workshop for 20 CEOs on leadership storytelling, and this guy in the group said, well, I came here, but I hate storytelling. I'm terrible at storytelling. And I said, well, why do you say that? And he said, well, one time I was at this client, I was telling this story, and it backfired on me. And everyone was like, wow, that's such an amazing story. I'm never going to forget that, right? So that's a great example of, so even if, children tell stories, grandparents tell stories, culture is passed down through history, through stories. We are all, just as we're wired visually, as humans, we are wired for story, right? If you hear the beginning of a story, we need to know how it ends to have that closure. If you ever watched a movie that you hated, but you fast forward to the end, just because you had this need to find out how it ends, even though it doesn't really matter, there's a human need to have a beginning, a middle, and end. Aristotle said that a couple of thousand years ago, right? Stories have beginnings, middles, and ends. So as a leader, anytime you could tell a story, if you could wrap facts and figures in a story, again, stories humanize us, they are emotional, they are memorable, there are lessons, there are failure stories, success stories, cautionary tales. Like in every culture, we have our stories. So that's what I would say is leadership, storytelling is a skill that we already have, but it's also a skill that can be learned and developed, and we could get better at it. But when you think about what you remember from previous bosses and previous jobs, it tends to be the stories that you remember, stories that you told each other, stories about what happened. So that's why storytelling is such a powerful leadership skill that we often don't even think about.
Yeah, and especially if you incorporate with the visuals and incorporate with the numbers, and you find stories around it, to explain, definitely is very powerful. All those three items.
Yeah. Stories have, this is basic like newspaper story 101, right? There's the who, what, when, where, why, and how, right? Who is involved? What happened? When and where did it happen? Why did it happen? And how did it happen? Right? If you cover those in a story, you're going to be able to solve problems, communicate ideas more effectively. So let's say, a client comes to you with an issue, right? It's like, all right, who is the client, right? What is the issue they're facing? When and where does this issue happen? Why do we think it's happening, or why do they think it's happening? And then how can we solve it? you're not going to get to the how do we solve it unless you have those first 5 pieces of information. So if a client calls me, sometimes I'll have a client call me and say, because I do management, leadership training, and team building. They'll say, how much is leadership training? And I'll say, how much is a vacation, right? How much is a car, right? You didn't define the scope. It could be a 1-day thing or it could be a 1-year thing, right? So until you define the who is it for, what do you want to cover, when and where are we doing this, why do you want to do this, meaning what problem are you trying to solve, etc., then I could come up with the how, and then that will determine the how much. So if someone just says, I need a price quote, well, I'm just throwing a number or picking a number out of the air. So think about that for your business. Try to go down whenever you're talking to a client, identify the who and what, the when and where, the why, and the how. Then you could do a more accurate price quote, and then you could compare it to other similar things you've dealt with. But that's the story that the client is telling you. So we need to not just be good storytellers, but good story listeners. We need to be able to pull other people's stories out of them, learn from them, and then together we could paint create a better story for the future. So those are my thoughts on storytelling from a leadership perspective.
Yeah, that is very powerful, especially when it comes to marketing or sales departments, right?
Yeah.
So especially for sales, I mean, you trying to deliver a result which is at the right now is in your mind, right? You can only imagine that this is where the results we're gonna deliver. But if you can tell us stories around it, and if you can provide some visuals around it, and somebody can visualize those results what you're gonna deliver, is very powerful, as you mentioned.
Yeah, if you're trying to sell someone to buy a watch, for example, you want them to see and visualize the watch, that you want to have them picture, imagine you're in a business meeting and you look at the time and people like, wow, where'd you get that cool watch? Right? It could be smart watch, could be anything, but like whatever it is, so often we focus on the features and don't talk about the benefits. Or we focus on features and benefits, but we don't focus on the story of what does it look like and feel like to actually be owning and using this product, right? Yeah. When you sell a car, no one, unless you're a real car person, you don't care about the horsepower, what's under the hood. You want to picture yourself driving with the top down on the way to the beach on a sunny summer day, right? Yeah. That's what sells the car. It's not like, oh, gets this mileage and this some people may care about it, but that's not, it's again, facts, figures, and feelings. It's feelings that drive decisions.
Very interesting. Very powerful. Very interesting, Todd. How did you get so good at leadership? Talk about your journey a little bit. Did you had a good leaders or bad leaders? How did you get into leadership, and what experience you've been?
Well, I hold the Guinness Book of World Records for having worked for the worst bosses who've ever set foot on this planet. So that is what drove me into management, leadership development, and executive coaching, is all the bad, horrible bosses I've had. And I tell many of the stories in my book about the boss who threw a box of pens at my head and a few other horrible boss stories. But so often, as we know, people get promoted into management leadership roles because they're good at what they do. You're our top salesperson. You're now the sales manager. That's a completely different skill set, right? It's like taking the best athlete like a Michael Jordan and making him the coach, right? It doesn't mean you're great at coaching other people just because you're good at what you do. And saying just do it the way, that doesn't help, right? So it's a different skill set. So working for some really horrible bosses throughout my career, I learned how not to manage. I learned how not to lead. I learned how to destroy people's morale and how to make them feel horrible about themselves. And right. So the opposite of that is leadership that is motivational, that is inspiring, that is nurturing, that is encouraging. So if you think about how many people are disengaged in their jobs because of their relationship with their manager, there's an art and science to managing people. And again, without going through any training or coaching, some people are naturally good at it, but most people are not. So it's something that needs to be learned and developed and practiced. And there's tools, tips, and techniques for managing more effectively. So it was through having bad bosses and starting to read all these management leadership books that are behind me. And that's one of the things I'm known for. I started reading management leadership books in 1998, and I got so hooked on them, I started reading an average of one a week for the last 25 years. So I've read about 1,300 business books over the last 25 years. And I just finished number 52 for this year. So I could check off the list. I read one a week. I'll probably hit 60 because there's still a few weeks left in the year. But it's one thing to read all these books. It's another thing to put the ideas into practice, right? So that's the key thing. I always say the true value of knowledge is not in its accumulation, but in its application, right? So what did you learn? What can you do differently? How can you take this model and apply it? How could you be a more visual leader? It takes practice. It doesn't happen overnight, but over time. So that's what I would say. If you want to be a better communicator, manager, or leader, you need to work at it like with any other skills. So whether you're in sales or HR or IT, these are all skills that we need to develop to have, the soft skills, the people skills, the emotional intelligence skills. Those are the things that often go overlooked while we're focusing on the nuts and bolts of our job.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned you also teach in universities, Todd. Is there more hopeful with the younger generation, the better leadership coming up, or are we going the wrong direction?
Well, the good thing is that they're there learning, right? So at NYU, I teach leadership and team building in the HR master's program. And at Columbia, I teach in a couple of different programs, strategic communication, and I teach leadership for Broadway stage managers in the theater program. So we're trying to just get leadership lessons out there among people who are earlier in their career, because my mission is to make the world a better place, one leader at a time. And to me, everyone is a leader, even if you're just leading your own life, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even if you don't work, or you just work for yourself, you still have to manage your life and you still have to lead your life, right? So these management leadership skills apply to you. And if you think about your life as a project to be managed, all of these skills could be applied to help you to be more efficient and more effective in what you do. And then if you're working with other people, all these skills will help you to be a more collaborative team member, a better communicator, better at problem solving. So so it's definitely the younger generation. Again, in the graduate school, these are people who are like in their 20s and 30s. So hopefully I'm getting them before they start to develop a lot of bad habits, right?
Yeah.
So often, they did a study years ago and found that most people get their first management leadership role around late 20s, early 30s, but they don't, quote, earn the right to go through any kind of leadership development or executive coaching until they're in their 40s into a more senior. So what's happening? So you have all these horrible bosses in their 20s and 30s who've never learned how to manage and lead. So we need to get to people earlier, if not in childhood. There's a lot of people doing work with younger people and trying to democratize leadership and get leadership skills into kids at the earliest possible ages, because that will reduce bullying. It will help to build teamwork. So the earlier the better when it comes to leadership development.
Definitely, that's a skill set every business can use, right? So you need to build that. I think the early on is a great point. We got to start building that in a kid, so they grow up to be a little bit, at least they're working on themselves as they go through.
Yeah. When I ask my students, I say, how many of you are leaders? And they don't know whether to raise their hand a lot. If you define leadership based on your title and you think you're only a leader if you're a CEO or president, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about acting as a leader. We're talking about exhibiting leadership traits, even if it's just helping to lead one person or helping someone solve a problem or helping someone see in themselves their potential that they didn't see, for themselves. Those are acts of leadership, right? So, and that could happen at any age and should happen at every age.
Wow, beautiful. Hey, every business leader has a toolkit, in their possession. Definitely your book and your body of work is definitely, they must have that. I learned just, when talking to you, going through your book, there's so much I learned, so much notes I made when I was going through it, and I've, made a list of items I need to implement in my business as well to get better. But I think everybody needs to acquire the cheat sheet and go through your book and start making a list. What do you need to implement? Any recommendation if somebody wants to work on becoming a better visually and also storytelling? Where can they start, or is there a starting point, or they just have to get better as they go through?
Yeah, I mean, to me, the starting point would be first watch my TED Talk, secondly, read my book, and I have a lot of our interviews like this, but also try things. It starts with awareness, right? So I would say start with noticing things. Thoreau has a famous quote that, it's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see, right? Two people could look at the same thing, but see things completely differently, which is fine. Neither one's right or wrong or better or worse, but just be more aware and more attuned to your environment. So for example, maybe there's that one person in your company who has untapped potential, but you haven't tapped into their potential. You haven't given them a chance or a stretch goal or delegated to them increased responsibility. So I end my TED Talk with the quote by Marcel Proust that the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new lands, but in seeing with new eyes, right? So it starts with seeing with new eyes. Start to notice things. Look at things from other people's perspectives with the spirit of empathy and compassion. If you're sitting at the top of the mountain, you don't have the same view as the people at the bottom of the mountain. There's that saying with sled dogs, only the lead dog has he has the best perspective. Every other dog is looking at the butt of the dog in front of them, right? So why do geese fly in V formation, right? It's to increase their flying effectiveness, right? But geese also rotate leadership. The lead goose will get tired and slip back, and another goose will step up and lead the V, and they'll rotate throughout, and they build off each other's wind resistance, just as bicycle racers do in like a Tour de France, right? So think about that. Are you rotating leadership? Are you, there's a saying, lead, follow, or get out of the way. Sometimes as a leader, the best thing you could do is get out of the way and let someone else step up to leadership, right? So our job as leaders is not just to lead others, but to develop the next generation of leaders. And you only learn how to lead by leading, right? So that's something leaders, in order to empower other people, need to voluntarily be willing to give up some of their own power. And it's scary and it's risky, but that's how you grow and learn and develop other people as leaders. So that's what I would say, is start to notice things differently, try new things, allow other people to lead. And sometimes you get out of the driver's seat, move over to the passenger seat, you navigate, let someone else drive. And sometimes you let someone else drive and let someone else navigate, and you sit in the back seat, right? So just that's rotating leadership. So leadership is not all about you. It's about your people, and it's about the vision and the mission of your organization. So that's what I would say, is try to just see things in different ways, and you'll never know what you may notice by doing that.
Very interesting, very powerful, Todd. I always have a one go-to book that I always, whoever I talk to, I usually give them a gift of book, right? So whenever I talk to people, I think your book's going to be my go-to book for definitely for all my employees and the business leaders I talk to, over the next few months. I think I'm going to just use your book as a gift. Hopefully they will learn from the book as well. But if somebody wants to buy the book, where can they buy it from?
Yeah, anywhere where books are sold, Amazon or your local bookstore. If they don't have it, you can request it. But yeah, either online or they just started carrying it at Barnes and Noble in New York, which is great. So yeah, so that's what I would say.
Very interesting. People who can connect, if they want to connect with you, are you still open? Do you still take calls from people, or how do you still chat with the people, or how do you do that?
Yeah, the best way to reach me is LinkedIn. Like, I live on LinkedIn. So just say you saw me on Gurmeet's show and you enjoyed the conversation. That way I know where you found me. But yeah, just connect with me on LinkedIn. We can have a conversation there. Go to my website, toddcherches.com. I have two websites. My company is called BigBlueGumball. So that's my company site. And then my toddcherches.com site is for my speaking and my book. And more about visual leadership. So just sign up for my email list. I don't send things out too often, but when I do, it's usually something of value. But I think that's the key thing, is just start to see things with a new lens and realize visual leadership is a whole different way of looking at leadership.
So what's this BigBlueGumball? What's the company's about, Todd? What do you do? And is that a leadership training company or is something else?
Yeah, this is BigBlueGumball. This is my, where's the, there we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, BigBlueGumball. We do management and leadership development, executive coaching, team building, anything related to soft skills. So I don't touch any of the IT type of stuff that you guys do. So anything related to people skills. So if you want to be a better manager, leader, team builder, and also any people skills related to presentation skills, visual thinking, confidence building, influencing, any of those human skills. Time management is a hot topic, as is feedback. Giving and receiving feedback is such an important part of leadership and management, and yet so many people don't know how to do it or don't do it well. So there's a couple of chapters in my book, my five types of feedback, my feedback sandwich chapter. So I have a few different chapters on that, but that's another thing I train people on, especially during performance review season. I get a lot of requests because companies spend all this money on doing like 360s and feedback and all this kind of stuff, but you get a manager and employee behind closed doors, and that conversation doesn't always go so well because no one's trained in how to have that conversation. So I train people in how to have that conversation so it's more productive and more effective and more morale boosting instead of demotivating, which it very often is.
Very interesting. I'm going to include a link to all those, your website, your company, and your book as well below this video. People can click a link. Definitely, I learned so much. I encourage all business leaders to reach out to you for conversation, and at least order the book for sure. That is the must have a tool on your toolkit. So order the book, connect with you. But I really want to appreciate your time, Todd. Thank you so much for time. Enjoy our discussion. Learn so much from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Gurmeet.
Okay.